Thousands of years ago, in a land torn by war and shaped by faith, Israel was rising as a unified nation under one leader, King David. Before he sat on the throne, he was just a simple shepherd boy, a brave kid who took down the giant Goliath with nothing but a stone and a sling. Now, wearing the crown, David faced an even bigger challenge, bringing his kingdom together and finding a capital that would represent the heart and soul of his people. Back then, Israel's tribes were scattered everywhere, each doing their own thing, fighting their own battles. David had a vision of one city that would unite them all, a sacred center where everyone could worship the same God and live under one flag. That city, Jerusalem. But Jerusalem wasn't just sitting there waiting to be claimed. Located in a prime strategic spot between the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, it was a fortress controlled by the Jebusites, a proud and battle-hardened people. They were so confident in their defenses that they literally mocked the Israelites, saying even the blind and the lame could protect the city against them. David wasn't intimidated. He knew the terrain. Jerusalem sat high up, surrounded by deep valleys, but he'd also heard rumors about a secret water tunnel that led right inside the walls. It was a risky move, but David believed God was with him, just like when he faced Goliath. In the days before the battle, David gathered his most trusted men. These were warriors who'd fought by his side through forests and deserts when King Saul was hunting him down. Loyal fighters ready to die for him. Among them were Joab, the army commander, and his brother Abishai, both war veterans. While the Jebusite army trusted their walls to keep them safe, David and his warriors were plotting something quiet. The night was cold when the king looked at Jerusalem from a distance. Torches flickered on the walls, and the sound of guards echoed in the wind. David knew this was the moment. If he won, he'd gain not just a city, but an eternal symbol for his people. If he failed, his entire reign could crumble. The Israelite camp was buzzing with anticipation. Men prayed, sharpened swords, and adjusted their armor. Some were anxious, others scared, but everyone trusted David. He wasn't just a king, he was a leader who inspired courage, a man who believed every victory came from God's hands. Before dawn, David stepped away from camp and stared at the starlit sky. In silence, he asked for wisdom and strength. He remembered the prophet Samuel's words and the sacred oil that had been poured on his head years ago when God chose him to be king. Now, that destiny was right in front of him. Jerusalem was his final test. At daybreak, David gathered his army and spoke firmly. He told them the Lord had delivered the city into Israel's hands, and no wall, no matter how high, could stand against God's will. His words reignited his soldiers' spirits. They marched with faith and determination, ready to write a new chapter in Israel's history. As the sun rose on the horizon, Jerusalem's walls gleamed golden. Inside, the Jebusites laughed and felt invincible. Little did they know that David's courage and his warriors' faith were about to change that city's destiny forever. With sunrise, David gathered his most experienced men. He knew Jerusalem wouldn't fall with a simple frontal attack. The Jebusite walls were tall, thick, and protected by skilled archers. Any direct attempt would be suicide. This required strategy. While the army held position while watching the city, David called Joab, his commander. He revealed his plan. Enter through an underground tunnel that led to a water reservoir inside the city. This channel, known by local, was vital for Jerusalem's water supply. If they could get in that way, they could surprise the Jebusites from the inside. Joab listened carefully and, without hesitation, volunteered to lead the attack. He was a fierce warrior, and David promised that whoever went up first against the Jebusites would become the chief of Israel's army. Joab accepted the challenge without fear. Meanwhile, the Jebusites watched the Israelites from the walls and laughed. They believed they were totally safe. They shouted insults, mocked David, and called him a fool. To them, no army could penetrate those walls. But that very night, under the cover of darkness, destiny would begin to shift. Joab, along with a small group of warriors, moved silently toward the tunnel. The sound of running water muffled their steps, the air was heavy and damp, and the narrow path made it hard to move. Still, they pressed on, guided by faith and courage. While the men crawled through the tunnel, David and the rest of the army waited outside, ready to strike at the right moment. The king showed no fear. His gaze was steady. He knew victory would come, but he also knew it depended on his men's bravery in that instant. Hours passed until Joab and his group emerged inside the city. They were covered in mud, but their hearts were on fire. When they appeared in the shadows of Jerusalem's streets, they found the Jebusite guards completely unprepared. The first strike was quick and silent. Within minutes, chaos started spreading through the alleys and walls. Alarm cries echoed through the city. The Jebusites rushed to the towers, but it was too late. David gave the signal, and the Israelite army charged with full force. Arrows crossed the sky, shields clashed, and the sound of swords rang through the ancient stones. The fight was intense. The Jebusites fought bravely, but they were at a disadvantage. Surprised and disorganized, they tried to regroup, but the Israelites already controlled most of the gates and walls. David's strategy had worked perfectly. In the middle of the battle, David watched everything from high ground. He saw his men fighting with honor, men saw the enemy resisting desperately, and understood that this moment would mark the beginning of a new era. With every meter conquered, Israel's name grew stronger. When the sun began to set, Jerusalem's streets belonged to David's army. Joab, wounded but victorious, went to the king and knelt before him. He'd kept his promise. David named him commander, honoring his bravery in front of the whole army. That night, the king entered Jerusalem for the first time as a conqueror. The city that had mocked him now bowed before his faith and strategy. But David knew this victory wasn't just military, it was spiritual. He believed God had delivered Jerusalem into his hands so it could become the center of the kingdom and the place where his presence would dwell. The sound of flutes and drums spread through the camp. Soldiers celebrated, sang, and thanked God. After so many battles, they finally had a city they could call their own, but David, even amid the celebration, kept his gaze serious. He knew the conquest was just the beginning. Jerusalem needed to be rebuilt, strengthened, and transformed into a capital worthy of Israel's people. After the victory, Jerusalem changed forever. The streets that had witnessed Jebusite resistance now filled with the sound of songs and prayers from Israel's people. David, victorious, walked through the rubble, observing every detail of the city he just conquered. He knew this was the beginning of something much bigger. The king's first decision was to make Jerusalem the political and spiritual center of Israel. Its location was perfect, now right in the middle of the tribal territories, making it accessible to everyone. Plus, since it didn't belong to any specific tribe, the city could be a symbol of unity, a capital for all Israelites. Over the following days, David ordered the city to be restored. The old Jebusite houses were rebuilt, walls reinforced, and new roads opened. Warriors who'd fought by his side received land, and entire families began moving inside the walls. Jerusalem, and once a foreign fortress, was now becoming a home. David also established his residence there. The palace was built with stones brought from far away, and skilled craftsmen were called to decorate the kingdom's new center. For the first time, Israel had a capital worthy of its king. But for David, something was still missing. He knew Jerusalem couldn't be just the political capital, it also needed to be the spiritual heart of the people. And for that, he needed to bring the Ark of the Covenant there, the ultimate symbol of God's presence among the Israelites. The Ark was kept in Abinadab's house. Since the time the Philistines had been defeated, David decided to bring it to Jerusalem with honor and celebration. He organized a huge procession, gathering priests, musicians, and the people. The convoy set out joyfully, carrying the Ark on a new cart, while drums and harps played victory songs. Along the way, people sang and danced. It was a historic moment, full of emotion. But something unexpected happened. When the oxen pulling the cart stumbled, a man named Uzzah reached out to steady the Ark and was struck down instantly. The people were terrified, and David, shaken, understood that God's presence demanded respect and holiness. Fearing to continue, he decided to leave the Ark for a while at Obed-Edom's house. For 3 months, the house was blessed, and David understood that the mistake wasn't in bringing the Ark, but in not following God's instructions. So he organized a new procession, now led by the Levites, as the law required. When the Ark of the Covenant finally entered Jerusalem, the entire nation gathered to celebrate. David, overcome with joy, danced before the Ark with all his strength. He didn't care about his position as king, he just wanted to express gratitude and worship. The people joined him, singing and playing instruments. Jerusalem in that day officially became the city of God. David built an altar, offered sacrifices, and blessed the people in the Lord's name. The atmosphere was one of celebration and emotion, but not everyone shared the same joy. Michal, Saul's daughter and David's wife, watched from a window as the king danced and despised him in her heart. She thought it was undignified for a king to behave that way, but David responded that he didn't dance to please men, but to honor the God who had chosen him over her father. That moment forever marked Israel's history. Jerusalem was no longer just a conquered city. It was the symbol of the covenant between God and his people, a place where faith, courage, and new beginnings met. David looked at the rebuilt walls, heard voices echoing through the streets, and felt his destiny was fulfilled. The The shepherd from Bethlehem now ruled over a unified nation, and Jerusalem would be, from then on, the eternal heart of Israel. With Jerusalem transformed into Israel's capital, David finally reached the peak of his leadership. The city grew rapidly, merchants came from distant lands, priests settled in the temporary temple where the Ark of the Covenant rested, and people began to feel they were living in a time of true prosperity. But even with victory and peace, David's heart remained restless. He wanted to do something even greater to honor God's presence in Jerusalem. In his palace one night, while watching the stars shine over the city, the king spoke with the prophet Nathan. David expressed his desire to build a great temple, a permanent house for the Lord. Nathan, moved with emotion, said David should do everything in his heart. But that same night, God spoke to the prophet and gave him a message for the king. David wouldn't be the one to build the temple because he'd shed too much blood in battles. That task would fall to his son, who would reign in peace and raise the Lord's sacred dwelling. When David heard these words, he wasn't sad. On the contrary, he knelt and thanked God for all the blessings. He understood that his role had been to prepare the way. His reign would be remembered as the time of conquest, unity, and promise. In the following years, David dedicated his life to strengthening Jerusalem and organizing the kingdom. He formed armies, established councils, and ensured the city became the political and spiritual center of Israel's people. He also composed many psalms, songs that expressed his faith, repentance, and love for God. These words would become eternal, repeated by generations that would come after him. As time passed, the king grew old. His face bore the marks of war, but his eyes still shone with the same faith he had when he faced Goliath. Jerusalem, now prosperous and protected, reflected his courage and devotion. David often walked the city walls at sunset. He watched children playing in the streets, priests singing songs, merchants in the squares, and felt deep pride. The city that once belonged to the Jebusites was now the beating heart of Israel. In his final days, David gathered his counselors and his son Solomon. He handed him the plan for building the temple and blessed him, saying that wisdom and peace would be a king's greatest weapons. He asked Solomon to continue ruling with justice, always remembering that Israel's throne belonged, above all, to God. When David died, mourning swept through Jerusalem. People wept for days, remembering the shepherd who became king, the warrior who never lost his faith, and the leader who had transformed a pagan city into the symbol of God's presence. Over time, David's memory crossed generations. His name became synonymous with courage, faith, and leadership. Jerusalem, his greatest conquest, remained the spiritual center of the ancient world, and to this day, it's remembered as the City of David. So the story of the king who unified Israel and conquered Jerusalem doesn't end in battles, but in legacy. A legacy that spans millennia, reminding us that a man's true greatness isn't just in the wars he wins, but in the faith and hope he leaves for those who come after.